Everyone thought she died in 1990, until I zoomed in on her school portrait 22 years later and realized she'd been screaming for help through the ink the entire time. Hello, welcome. You didn't find this by accident. These are stories of quiet courage, hidden truths, and people who chose heart over fear. If that pulls you in, please subscribe, tap the notification bell, and stay with us. Thank you. The humidity of Lagos in the dry season had a way of clinging to everything, a thick, invisible shroud that turned the simple act of breathing into a conscious effort. Tunde Dami wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead as he stood in the center of his parents' attic, surrounded by the skeletal remains of a life lived in the 90s. The air was heavy with the scent of mothballs and disintegrating newsprint, a pungent perfume of nostalgia that made his chest tighten with an unexpected ache. He was here to pack, to finally clear out the relics of his youth before the house was sold, yet every box he opened felt like a trapdoor into a past he had spent years trying to outrun. His hands, usually steady from years of handling delicate digital sensors and high-resolution scanning equipment, trembled slightly as he pulled a heavy, plastic-bound book from the bottom of a cedar chest. It was the 1990 Bright Minds Academy Yearbook, its once vibrant blue cover now faded to a dull, bruised purple. He ran his thumb over the embossed gold, lettering the texture, sparking a vivid sensory memory of the day he had received it. The sound of children laughing on the playground, the smell of jollof rice wafting from the cafeteria, and the high, clear voice of Amara Okafor as she teased him about his messy handwriting. He sat down on a stack of old crates, the wood groaning beneath him, and slowly cracked the spine of the book. The pages were brittle, the edges yellowed like ancient parchment, but the faces within remained frozen in an eternal, youthful innocence. He skipped past the faculty photos and the sports teams, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs until he reached the class of 1990 section. And there she was, Amara, the girl with the defiant eyes and the lopsided pigtails who had been his world before the world turned cold. Looking at her picture felt like staring directly into the sun. It was a physical blow that left him breathless. In 1990, she had vanished into thin air during the school's most crowded event, leaving behind nothing but a half-eaten meat pie and a grieving father. Tunde had spent decades wondering if he had imagined the depth of their connection, if the crush he felt was merely the exaggerated fancy of a 10-year-old boy. But as he looked at her face, the decades of logic and adulthood fell away, leaving only the raw, jagged edge of a loss that had never truly healed. He closed the book, but as the light from the small attic window hit the page at a sharp angle, something caught his eye, a tiny, irregular texture on the print of Amara's school blazer that didn't appear on any of the other students' photos. Back in his high-tech studio in Lekki, the contrast between the dusty attic and his pristine workspace felt like a leap across a century. Tunde carefully placed the 1990 yearbook onto the bed of his industrial-grade flatbed scanner, a machine capable of capturing details invisible to the naked eye. He worked with a surgical focus, calibrating the light levels and the DPI settings, his mind racing with a cocktail of professional curiosity and personal obsession. He told himself he was just curious, that he was merely applying his skills as a forensic archivist to a personal curiosity, but the heat in his gut told a different story. As the scanner's light bar crawled across the page, a high-resolution image materialized on his dual-monitor setup, blooming like a digital flower. He zoomed in on Amara's portrait, past the grain of the paper, past the ink dots of the four-color printing process, until her face filled the entire screen. Even at this magnification, she was beautiful, the sharp intelligence in her gaze seemingly directed straight at him across the chasm of 22 years. But it wasn't her face that held his attention now. It was the lapel of her blazer, specifically the area just beneath the school crest, where a series of microscopic indentations marred the surface of the image. He leaned closer, his nose almost touching the screen, his breath hitching as he adjusted the contrast and applied a sharpening filter. At first, it looked like a simple printing error, perhaps a bit of debris caught on the plate during the press run. But as the software smoothed out the digital noise, a pattern began to emerge, a deliberate, rhythmic sequence of dots and dashes that seemed to vibrate with a hidden meaning. These weren't random artifacts. They were structured, intentional, and hauntingly familiar. Tunde felt a cold shiver race down his spine, despite the afternoon heat pouring through the studio windows. He recognized the spacing, the way the larger dots were clustered in groups of 3. It was a variation of bird speak, a secret code he and Amara had developed using a mixture of Yoruba tonal marks and simplified Morse code to pass notes under the watchful eyes of their strict teachers. He felt a sudden, dizzying sense of vertigo, as if the floor had dropped out from under him. The yearbook had been printed and distributed after Amara's disappearance. If this code was indeed what he thought it was, it meant that someone, or Amara herself, had accessed the printing plates at the very last second. He slumped back into his ergonomic chair, the blue light of the monitor reflecting in his wide eyes. This wasn't just a glitch in a photo, it was a message in a bottle, cast into the sea of time, finally washing up at his feet. The memory of that final inter-house sports day in 1990 remained etched in Tun's mind like a scar that throbbed whenever the weather changed. The air at Bright Minds Academy had been thick with the scent of freshly cut grass, cheap orange glucose drinks, and the collective adrenaline of 500 children screaming for their respective houses. Amara had been wearing the vibrant yellow of Canary House, her hair woven into intricate cornrows that danced against her neck as she warmed up for the 100-meter sprint. Tund, a lanky boy in the deep green of Forest House, had watched her from across the track, his heart doing a frantic relay of its own. She had caught his eye and flashed that signature gap-toothed grin, the one that made him feel like he was the only person in the crowded stadium. They had shared a smuggled meat pie behind the bleachers just 20 minutes before her race, whispering about their plans to start a detective agency during the long vacation. Amara had given him a small, braided friendship bracelet made of yellow and green thread, a silent pact that they would always be a team. But when the starter pistol finally cracked the humid air and the runners surged forward, Amara wasn't among them. Her lane 4, remained hauntingly empty, a narrow strip of red clay that seemed to stretch into an infinite, terrifying void. The transition from festive chaos to cold, paralyzing panic happened in a heartbeat. The music stopped, the cheering died, and the sun seemed to lose its warmth as the realization settled that the daughter of the most powerful man in the city had vanished in the blink of an eye. The days that followed were a blur of sirens, weeping mothers, and the stern, terrifying faces of men in dark suits who paced the school corridors. Tund had kept the yellow and green bracelet hidden in his sock, terrified that the men would take it away, thinking it was a clue they needed more than he did. He remembered the way Chief Okafor had looked, a titan of industry reduced to a hollowed-out shell of a man, standing on the school's assembly ground while the tropical rain drenched his expensive Egbata. Every evening, Tund would sit by the radio, listening for news, his young mind unable to process the finality of a missing person report. To him, Amara was just hidden, perhaps playing the ultimate game of hide-and-seek that they had talked about behind the bleachers. He spent hours walking the perimeter of the school fence, looking for a sign, a scrap of yellow fabric, or another one of their secret bird-speak codes scratched into the dirt. As weeks turned into months, the vibrant colors of that day faded into the gray reality of her absence. The school eventually moved on. The empty desk in his classroom was filled by a new boy from Port Harcourt, and the whispers about the Okafor curse became the stuff of playground legends. But Tund never took the bracelet off until it literally rotted away, and even then, he kept the frayed threads in a matchbox under his bed, a silent sentinel for a girl who had become a ghost before she had even become a woman. In the cold, sterile light of 2012, Tund sat before his monitors, the ghost of 1990, now a digital specter waiting to be exorcised. He pulled up a blank document and began the painstaking process of transcribing the microscopic dots he had found on Amara's lapel. The bird-speak code was a complex beast, a hybrid language they had invented to bypass the literacy of adults. It relied on the tonal shifts of Yoruba, represented by the spacing of dots, combined with a rhythmic structure borrowed from the talking drum. As he translated the first cluster, his fingers flew across the keyboard, fueled by a frantic, nervous energy. The first sequence translated to not, followed by a series of more complex clusters that required him to dig deep into his childhood memories to recall the specific tonal markers they had assigned to certain vowels. It was a labor of love and madness, a man talking to a child through the medium of ink and pixels. He worked through the night, the only sound in the studio being the hum of the cooling fans and the occasional distant honk of a car on the Lekiep Expressway. The air in the room felt thick with a presence he couldn't explain, as if Amara were standing just behind his shoulder, guiding his hand as he navigated the labyrinth of their private language. By 4:00 a.m., a sentence had formed on the screen, shimmering in the harsh white light of the word processor. It read, "Not dead, Shadowland, find the keeper." Tund stared at the words until they blurred, his mind reeling from the implications. This wasn't a message from a kidnapper, it was a message from a survivor. The yearbook had been printed 6 months after her disappearance, a commemorative edition released during the Christmas term. If this code was on the printing plate, it meant that someone within the publishing house had either been complicit or had been reached by Amara herself. The term Shadowland sent a jolt of recognition through him, a name from a half-forgotten geography lesson, or perhaps a story told by the elders. It didn't sound like a place on a map, but rather a nickname for somewhere specific, somewhere dark. He began a deep-dive search into the historical archives of Nigerian land registries and colonial-era plantation names, his forensic skills now serving a purpose far greater than any corporate contract he had ever signed. The keeper was the final piece of the puzzle, a person, a guardian, or perhaps a jailer. He realized that for 22 years, the world had been looking for a body, but the yearbook was telling him to look for a prisoner. The weight of the discovery was almost too much to bear. He felt a sudden, fierce protectiveness over the secret, a need to shield this fragile flame of hope from the winds of a world that had long since moved on. The sun rose over the Lagos Lagoon, casting a bruised orange glow over the city's skyline, but Tund hadn't moved from his desk. His eyes were bloodshot, his skin sallow in the monitor's glow, but his mind was sharper than it had been in years. He had narrowed down Shadowland to a defunct rubber plantation in the hinterlands of Ogun State, a place that had once been the crown jewel of a colonial enterprise before being swallowed by the encroaching rainforest and local superstition. According to land records, the plantation had been bought in the late 80s by a shell company, Irawaru Investments, whose directors were hidden behind a veil of legal proxies. However, Tund's digital forensic tools were designed to pierce such veils. He traced the money trail back through decades of bank transfers and dusty ledger entries, his heart skipping a beat when he found a recurring payment for maintenance and security directed toward a small village on the edge of the plantation. The payments were consistent, silent, and originated from a private trust managed by a law firm that had once represented the Okafor family. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The call was coming from inside the house. The disappearance wasn't a random act of violence or a botched ransom attempt. It was a calculated, internal removal, a secret kept within the very walls that should have protected her. He began to piece together the timeline of the 1990 printing. The yearbook had been printed by Apex Press, a mid-sized firm in Mushin. Tund accessed the digitized personnel files of the company from that era, looking for a keeper. He found a man named Samuel Ocken, a master typesetter who had been with the company for 30 years before retiring abruptly in 1991. Ocken had been known for his meticulous attention to detail and his uncanny ability to spot errors that no one else could see. Tund theorized that Amara, perhaps held briefly in a location near the press, or by someone connected to it, had managed to pass a message to Ocken, or perhaps Ocken was the keeper himself, someone who knew she was alive but was too terrified to speak out. Choosing instead to hide the truth in the only place he knew it would be preserved, the immortality of the printed word. Tund felt a surge of respect for the old typesetter. It was a brilliant, subtle act of rebellion, a way to keep the truth alive without inviting the wrath of the powerful men who wanted it buried. He packed his laptop and a portable scanner into his leather messenger bag, his decision made. He couldn't go to the police, not yet. In a world where money could erase people and buy silence for 20 years, he needed the one person whose grief was as vast as the ocean and whose power was a match for the shadows. He needed Chief Okafor. The Okafor estate in Ikoyi was a fortress of marble and wrought iron, a monument to a man who had conquered the business world but lost his soul in the process. Tund stood at the massive gates, feeling like an ant at the foot of a mountain. It took 3 hours of arguing with security and 2 phone calls to high-ranking associates before he was finally granted an audience. He was led through hallways lined with original African art and photographs of the chief with world leaders, but the house felt empty, a gilded mausoleum for a family that no longer existed. He eventually found Chief Okafor in a sun-drenched study that smelled of old leather and expensive tobacco. The chief was 80 now, his once formidable frame shrunken, his eyes clouded with the cataracts of age and the bitterness of a life lived in a permanent state of mourning. He didn't look up when Tund entered, his gaze fixed on a small, framed photo on his desk, the same photo Tund had been staring at on his monitor for the last 48 hours. The silence in the room was heavy, a physical pressure that made Tund's ears ring. He realized then that the chief hadn't just lost a daughter, he had lost the ability to believe in anything other than the cruelty of fate. "I am busy, young man," the chief said, his voice a raspy whisper that still carried the echoes of authority. "Whatever you are selling, I have already bought it, and it didn't work." Tund didn't speak. Instead, he walked forward and placed the 1990 yearbook on the mahogany desk, opening it to the page he had marked. He then pulled out his tablet and showed the chief the high-resolution scans, the bird-speak translation, and the map of the Shadowland plantation. He explained the code, the typesetter, and the hidden payments from the family trust. As he spoke, he watched the chief's face transform. It was like watching a statue come to life. The color returned to his cheeks, his hands began to shake, and his eyes cleared, focusing on the screen with a terrifying intensity. When Tund finished, the room fell into a silence so profound that the ticking of the grandfather clock sounded like a hammer against an anvil. The chief reached out, his gnarled fingers hovering over the image of Amara's face, a single tear tracing a path through the deep wrinkles of his cheek. "You found her," the old man breathed, his voice breaking with a lifetime of suppressed hope. "You found my Amara." However, the initial spark of hope was quickly dampened by a wave of veteran cynicism. Chief Okafor stood up, his joints popping, and began to pace the length of the study, his face hardening into a mask of skepticism. "Do you know how many people have come to this house with proof?" he barked, his voice regaining its thunderous edge. "I have spent millions on private investigators, psychics, and retired Mossad agents. I have followed leads into the slums of Cotonou and the high-rises of London. Every time it is the same, a lie, a mistake, or a cruel joke played by someone looking for a payout." He turned to Tund, his eyes burning with a mixture of anger and desperation. "How do I know you haven't manufactured this? How do I know this bird-speak isn't just a clever story you've constructed after researching my daughter's life? You are a forensic digital artist, are you not? You specialize in the manipulation of reality. Give me one reason why I should believe a boy who used to have a crush on her over the 22 years of silence that have buried her." Tund felt the weight of the chief's doubt, a cold wind that threatened to extinguish the fire he had spent the night building. He realized that the chief wasn't just resisting the information, he was resisting the pain of being wrong again. Tund stood his ground, meeting the old man's gaze with a steadiness he didn't know he possessed. "I am not looking for a payout, chief. I am looking for the girl who gave me a yellow and green bracelet 22 years ago, he said softly, reaching into his pocket and pulling out the matchbox. He opened it, revealing the ancient, decayed threads he had kept since 1990. "This isn't digital manipulation. This is the only thing I have left of her, and I would not dishonor it with a lie. The code in the yearbook isn't just information, it's a personality. It's the way she used to shorten the O sound in her name, a quirk only we knew. Look at the payments, chief. Look at the law firm Balagun and Associates. They've been your family's fixers for 40 years. Why would they be paying a village in Ogun State for 20 years if there was nothing there to keep?" The mention of the law firm seemed to strike a chord. The chief went still, his expression shifting from anger to a chilling, cold realization. He knew the firm, he knew the men who ran it. And more importantly, he knew who in his family had the most to gain from Amara's disappearance. The resistance began to crumble, replaced by a cold, calculating fury that was far more dangerous. He picked up his phone, his voice steady and lethal. "Get my security detail ready. And get me the file on my brother's estate. We are going to Ogun." Before they could head into the interior, Tund insisted on one more stop. He needed to verify the physical origin of the yearbook's manipulation. They tracked down the original photographer of the 1990 class photos, a man named Pa Jerome, who now lived in a small, cluttered apartment above a photo studio in Surulere. The room was a museum of chemical photography, smelling of silver nitrate and vinegar. Pa Jerome was a man of fading memories, his mind a gallery of faces he had captured over 50 years, but the name Amara Okafor acted like a key in a rusted lock. He sat them down, his hands trembling as he poured tea from a chipped pot. "I remember that girl," he said, his eyes misting over, "not just because she was a chief's daughter, but because of what happened after. 2 days after I took those photos, 2 men came to my darkroom. They didn't have names, but they had guns and a lot of money. They told me I had to change one of the plates. They brought a new negative for Amara's photo. I told them it looked different, that the lighting was off, but they didn't care. They watched me burn the original negative and stood over me while I etched the new plate for the printing press. The chief leaned forward, his face a mask of controlled rage. "Did you see who sent them?" Jerome shook his head slowly. "No, but they used a car with a specific emblem, a golden hawk on the hood. I only saw it for a second when they drove away, but there was something else. One of the men, the one who did the talking, had a missing finger on his left hand. He was very precise, very cold. He told me that if the photo didn't look exactly like the one they provided, I wouldn't live to see the book published." Tun's mind raced. The Golden Hawk was the crest of the Arawaru Group, the same shell company he had found in the land registry. The piece of the puzzle was clicking into place with a sickening thud. The kidnapping hadn't been an external threat. It was a corporate extraction, a way to remove the primary heir to the Okafor fortune. Amara hadn't been killed because she was a living asset, a bargaining chip that had been kept in reserve for over 2 decades. Tund looked at the chief and saw the same realization dawning on him. The enemy wasn't a stranger in the shadows. It was his own flesh and blood, a betrayal that had cost him 22 years of his life. Back in the car, Tund pulled up the high-resolution scan of the new negative pod Jerome had mentioned. If the kidnappers had provided the negative, why would they include a hidden message? He began to re-examine the image, looking for a second layer of information. This time he didn't look at the blazer. He looked at the background, the standard blue-gray backdrop used for all school photos. Using a difference map algorithm, he compared Amara's background to that of his own photo. A series of faint, translucent lines appeared, invisible to the eye but clear to the computer's logic. They were coordinates, GPS longitudes and latitudes, represented in an old-fashioned surveying format. The keeper, Samuel Aachen, hadn't just hidden a message, he had hidden a map. It became clear that Aachen wasn't one of the bad guys. He was a silent guardian who had risked everything to leave a trail that only a modern-day detective could follow. He had etched the coordinates into the negative itself, a masterful feat of micro-engraving that had survived the printing process and 22 years of decay. "Chief, look," Tund said, showing him the coordinates overlaid on a satellite map of Ogun State. They pointed to a specific structure deep within the Shadowland plantation, a colonial-era manor house that was officially listed as a ruin. However, the satellite imagery showed something different. The roof was intact, there were clear paths cut through the jungle, and a small helipad was visible near the eastern wing. This wasn't a ruin, it was a private black site. The chief's eyes narrowed as he looked at the screen. "That house belonged to my younger brother, Segun. He died 10 years ago in a boating accident in Switzerland. I thought the property had been sold to the state." Tund shook his head. The title was never transferred. It was held in a perpetual trust managed by Balagun and Associates. "Your brother might be dead, but his ghost is still running this place." The realization that his own brother had been the architect of his misery seemed to break something inside the chief, but in its place grew a cold, diamond-hard resolve. He wasn't just a grieving father anymore. He was a warlord preparing for a final campaign. The journey into the interior began at dawn. The chief's security detail, a team of elite, silent men in black SUVs, moved with a disciplined precision that mirrored Tund's own digital focus. They left the chaotic sprawl of Lagos behind, the concrete jungle giving way to the lush, suffocating green of the Ogun rainforest. As they drove, Tund monitored the GPS coordinates, his laptop balanced on his knees, his fingers constantly adjusting the signal strength of their satellite link. The air grew cooler and more humid, the road narrowing until it was little more than a dirt track carved through the towering mahogany trees. Tund felt a sense of dread pooling in his stomach. This was the place where time had stopped for Amara. For 22 years, while he was going to university, starting a career, and living his life, she had been buried here, a princess in a tower of thorns. He wondered what she would look like, what she would remember. Would she still have that lopsided pigtail? Would she even recognize the boy who had once shared a meat pie with her? They reached the perimeter of the plantation by mid-afternoon. The Shadowland was aptly named. The canopy was so thick that the ground was cast in a permanent, emerald twilight. They found the first gate, a rusted iron monstrosity draped in creepers and guarded by 2 men who didn't look like ordinary security. They were older, with the weary, haunted look of men who had been guarding a secret for too long. When the chief's SUV pulled up, they didn't reach for their weapons. They simply stood aside, their eyes wide with a mixture of terror and relief. It was as if they had been waiting for this day for 20 years. The chief didn't even look at them as they drove past. He was staring straight ahead, his hands gripped so tightly on his cane that his knuckles were white. Tund felt the tension in the car reach a breaking point. They were entering the heart of the mystery, a place where the past and the present were about to collide in a spectacular, life-altering crash. The deeper they ventured into the plantation, the more the environment felt like a living entity, a green labyrinth designed to swallow the unwary. The SUV bounced over thick roots and through shallow streams that ran red with the iron-rich soil of the region. Tund watched the signal's strength on his laptop flicker. They were moving beyond the reach of the modern world. He felt a strange disconnect. He was a man of the digital age, of pixels and algorithms, yet here he was, following a trail of ancient ink and family blood into a place that time forgot. The trees seemed to lean in, their branches like skeletal fingers reaching for the vehicles. Occasionally, they would see the ruins of old rubber processing sheds, their corrugated iron roofs rusted to the color of dried blood, looking like the carcasses of prehistoric beasts. The silence was absolute, save for the crunch of tires on gravel and the occasional haunting cry of a hornbill deep in the bush. As they approached the coordinates of the manor house, the forest suddenly opened up into a manicured clearing that felt jarringly out of place. It was a colonial relic, a sprawling two-story building with wide verandas and whitewashed walls that gleamed like a tooth in the dark maw of the jungle. It was beautiful and terrifying all at once. Tund saw movement in the upper windows, a flicker of a curtain, a shadow passing across a pane of glass. His heart leapt into his throat. Was she in there? Was he about to see the girl who had haunted his dreams for 2 decades? The chief ordered the vehicles to stop 100 yards from the entrance. He stepped out of the car, the humidity hitting him like a physical weight, but he didn't falter. He stood there, a king returning to a lost province, his eyes fixed on the front door. Tund followed him, his camera and laptop slung over his shoulder, his every sense heightened to a painful degree. They weren't just at a location, they were at the finish line of a 22-year marathon. Before they reached the house, a small group of villagers emerged from a cluster of huts nearby. They were led by an elderly woman with skin like crumpled silk and eyes that held the wisdom of a century. She stopped 10 paces from the chief and bowed low, a gesture of profound respect. "We knew you would come, great one," she said, her voice a melodic lilt. "The girl, she has been the light of this forest. We have kept her secret, as the great brother commanded, but our hearts have been heavy." Tund realized that the keeper wasn't just Samuel Aachen. It was an entire community bound by a mixture of loyalty, fear, and a strange, protective love for the girl they had watched grow into a woman. They hadn't seen her as a prisoner, but as a sacred charge, a hidden treasure they were tasked with preserving until the day of reckoning. The woman, whom the others called Mama Shade, explained that they had been told Amara's life depended on her staying within the plantation walls. They had been lied to, told that the world outside was a place of fire and death for her, and that only here, in the Shadowland, was she safe. The chief's face softened as he looked at the villagers. He realized that these people weren't his enemies, they were the unwitting accomplices in a grand deception, their innocence weaponized against him. Tund asked Mama Shade about the woman in the house. "She is quiet," Mama Shade said, a sad smile touching her lips. "She spends her days in the library, reading the books the great brother used to bring. She writes in the dirt with a stick, patterns that no one can understand. She says she is talking to the birds." Tund felt a jolt of electricity. The birds speak. She was still using it. She had been sending messages into the void for 22 years, hoping that one day, a bird would carry them back to the world. He felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to run to her, to tell her that the message had been received, that the bird had finally come home. But he stayed by the chief's side, knowing that this moment belonged to the father first. As they moved toward the manor, the chief's head of security, a man named Ade, intercepted a radio transmission from a nearby guard post. It was a frantic call to the law firm in Lagos, reporting the arrival of the chief. The web of betrayal was finally being stripped bare. Ade's team quickly moved to secure the perimeter, disarming the few remaining guards who had been paid by the trust to keep the asset hidden. Tund watched as the chief walked into the foyer of the house, his cane echoing on the marble floors. The interior was a time capsule of the early 90s. The furniture, the decor, even the magazines on the coffee table were frozen in 1990. It was as if the world had stopped the moment Amara entered this house. In the study, they found a safe containing the original documents of the Araowaro group. The papers revealed the cold, calculated motive. Segun had embezzled millions from the family business and had used Amara's disappearance to distract the chief while he consolidated power. He had planned to find her years later and claim the hero's reward, but his own death had left her stranded in a legal and physical limbo, a secret that no one dared to uncover for fear of the consequences. The chief sat at his brother's desk, looking at the signatures on the documents. "My own brother," he whispered, the words heavy with a grief that surpassed even the loss of his daughter. He watched me weep. He sat at my table and toasted to my health while his niece was a mile away, locked in a green cage. Tund felt a wave of nausea. The cruelty was staggering, to steal a child's life not for a grand cause, but for a line on a balance sheet. He looked at the chief and saw a man who was finally seeing the true face of his past. The wealth, the power, the prestige, it had all been a screen for a monster who wore his own face. But amidst the wreckage of the betrayal, there was still the girl. Or rather, the woman. Tund left the chief to his revelations and followed a sound he heard coming from the second floor, a soft, melodic humming that sounded like a song he had heard a lifetime ago. Tund climbed the grand staircase, his heart drumming a frantic beat against his ribs. Each step felt like a mile, each breath a struggle. He reached the landing and turned toward a room at the end of the hall, the door slightly ajar. The humming grew louder. It was the melody of a popular highlife song from 1990, the one they used to dance to during recess. He pushed the door open slowly. The hinges let out a soft groan. The room was bathed in the golden light of the late afternoon sun, which poured through a large bay window overlooking the forest. And there, silhouetted against the light, was a woman. She was tall, with a graceful, upright posture that reminded him instantly of the girl on the sprinting track. Her hair was no longer in pigtails, but flowed in a thick, dark cloud down her back. She was wearing a simple, white cotton dress, and her hands were busy weaving a small, intricate mat from dried grass. She didn't turn around immediately. "Is it time for tea, Mama Shade?" she asked, her voice low and musical, with a faint, archaic lilt that suggested she hadn't spoken to many people in a long time. Tund couldn't find his voice. He stood there, frozen, the weight of 22 years pressing down on him. Finally he managed to whisper a single word, "Amara." The woman stiffened. The mat fell from her hands, the dried grass scattering on the floor. She turned slowly, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and a dawning, impossible hope. Her face was an older, more refined version of the one in the yearbook, the same sharp intelligence, the same defiant gaze, but tempered by years of solitude and a quiet, resilient strength. She looked at him, her eyes searching his face, looking for a ghost in the man standing before her. "Tund," she breathed, the name a fragile thread in the silent room. The moment was interrupted by the sound of boots on the stairs. A man in a tailored suit, looking wildly out of place in the jungle, burst into the room followed by 2 armed guards. It was Mr. Balagun, the head of the law firm, the man who had managed the Shadowland secret for 2 decades. His face was pale, his eyes darting around the room like a trapped animal. "This is private property," he shouted, though his voice lacked conviction. "You have no right to be here. This woman is under the protection of a legal trust." Tund stepped between Amara and the lawyer, his fear replaced by a cold, protective fury. "The trust is over, Balagun," Tund said, his voice steady. "The chief is downstairs. The police are on their way. The game is finished." Balagun looked at Tund, then at Amara, and finally at the open doorway where Chief Okafor now stood, his presence filling the room like a gathering storm. The chief didn't say a word. He simply walked toward Balagun, his cane clicking on the floor with the finality of a judge's gavel. The guards, seeing the chief, lowered their weapons and stepped back, their loyalty to a paycheck no match for the raw power of a father's wrath. Balagun crumbled, sinking to his knees, a pathetic figure in the face of the truth he had tried so hard to bury. "It wasn't my idea," he stammered. "Segun, he forced me. The money, I was just following instructions." The chief ignored him, walking past the broken man as if he were nothing more than a piece of discarded trash. His gaze was fixed solely on his daughter. Amara stood her ground, her eyes locked on her father. The 22 years between them felt like a physical chasm, a vast, silent ocean that they were both terrified to cross. Tund realized they needed a bridge. He reached into his bag and pulled out a small, velvet-lined box. Inside was a physical item he had retrieved from the Okafor estate's vault with the chief's permission, a small gold locket that had belonged to Amara's mother. He handed it to her, his hand trembling slightly. She took it, her fingers brushing his, a spark of recognition flaring in her eyes. She opened the locket, seeing the miniature portrait of the mother she had barely known. A sob broke from her throat, a raw, primal sound that shattered the tension in the room. She looked at the chief, and for the first time she saw not a titan or a stranger, but the man who had tucked her in and told her stories about the stars. "Papa," she whispered. The chief dropped his cane and opened his arms. Amara ran to him, the two of them colliding in an embrace that seemed to hold the weight of the world. Tund stepped back, his eyes stinging with tears, as the sounds of weeping and whispered apologies filled the room. He looked out the window at the Shadowland, the green prison that was finally losing its power. He had done it. He had followed the ink and the pixels, the codes and the coordinates, and he had brought her back from the dead. He felt a sudden, profound exhaustion wash over him, a sense of a mission finally accomplished. But as he turned to leave the room to give them their privacy, Amara reached out and caught his hand. She didn't let go. Her grip was strong, a silent promise that the detective agency was finally back in business. The aftermath was a whirlwind of justice. Chief Okafor, reinvigorated by the return of his daughter, moved through the legal and corporate world like a harvesting machine. Balagun and Associates was dismantled within 48 hours, their dirty secrets spilled across the front pages of every newspaper in West Africa. The Golden Hawk of Irawu was struck down, its assets seized and its directors, those who were still alive, hauled before the courts. The chief didn't just want his daughter back, he wanted the world to know what had been done to her. Tund worked alongside the chief's legal team, providing the digital evidence and the forensic trail that linked the kidnapping to the corporate embezzlement. He became a fixture at the Okafor estate, a trusted advisor, and more importantly, a friend. Amara, however, was the true miracle. She adapted to the modern world with a speed that baffled the doctors and psychologists. She was hungry for knowledge, for the 22 years of history and culture she had missed. Tund spent his evenings with her, teaching her how to use a smartphone, explaining what the internet was, and catching her up on the music and films of the 2 decades she had lost. They sat on the veranda of the Ikoyi house, the Lagos skyline shimmering in the distance, and talked until the sun came up. Amara told him about her years in the manor, how she had practiced her bird speak every day to keep her mind sharp. How she had found the typesetter Samuel Ocken during a brief visit to the city in 1991 and had managed to slip him the coded message, and how she had never given up hope that Tund would find her. "I knew you were looking," she said one night, her hand resting on his. "I could feel you, like a radio signal in the dark." The final piece of the puzzle was the typesetter Samuel Ocken. They found him in a nursing home in Calabar, his mind failing but his heart still strong. When Amara walked into his room, the old man burst into tears, his hands reaching out to touch the girl he had tried to save 20 years ago. He told them how he had etched the plates, how he had lived in fear for years, and how he had prayed every night that someone would notice the glitch in the yearbook. Amara sat with him for hours, thanking him for the gift of her life. It was a moment of profound closure, a healing of the wounds that had been hidden for a generation. Tund watched them, realizing that the story wasn't just about a disappearance. It was about the quiet heroisms of ordinary people who refused to let the darkness win. The recovery of Amara's legal identity was a landmark case, but to her, it was simply the process of becoming herself again. She refused to be a victim, choosing instead to use her story to advocate for the missing and the forgotten. She and Tund established the Amara Foundation, a nonprofit that used forensic technology and community networks to track down long-term missing persons. They became a formidable team, his digital brilliance and her lived experience creating a beacon of hope for thousands of families. The Shadowland plantation was turned into a wildlife sanctuary and a memorial, the Green Labyrinth now a place of peace rather than a prison. The Keeper village was given land titles and resources, their role as Amara's protectors finally recognized and rewarded. 1 year after her return, a grand gala was held at the Bright Minds Academy. It was the school's 50th anniversary, and the entire class of 1990 had been invited back. Tund stood in the center of the redesigned assembly hall, looking at the faces of his former classmates, men and women in their 30s, many with children of their own. The air was filled with laughter and the smell of jollof rice, just like it had been 22 years ago. When Amara walked in, the room fell silent. She was wearing a dress of vibrant yellow and green, her hair styled in a modern, elegant version of the cornrows she had worn as a child. She looked radiant, a survivor who had turned her trauma into a triumph. She walked straight to Tund and took his hand. Together, they walked to the back of the hall, to the spot behind the bleachers where they had once shared a meat pie. The old wooden bleachers were gone, replaced by modern steel ones, but the feeling of the place was the same. Tund reached into his pocket and pulled out a new bracelet he had made, a perfect replica of the yellow and green one from 1990, but made of silk and gold thread. He tied it around her wrist, his hand steady this time. "For the detective agency," he whispered. Amara leaned in and kissed him, a kiss that tasted of the past, the present, and a future they were finally free to build together. The class of 1990 was finally complete. The story of the girl in the yearbook became a legend in Lagos, a tale told to children about the power of friendship and the importance of never letting go. Tund and Amara's wedding was the event of the decade, a celebration that brought together the highest levels of society and the humble villagers from the Shadowland. Chief Okafor, looking younger than he had in years, walked his daughter down the aisle, his face a picture of pure, unadulterated joy. He had lost 22 years, but he had gained a lifetime of meaning. The legacy of the Okafor family was no longer defined by a disappearance, but by a miraculous return. As the sun set over the Atlantic on their honeymoon, Tund and Amara sat on the beach, the waves lapping at their feet. Tund pulled out his tablet, habit still pulling him toward the digital world, but Amara gently closed the cover. "No more searching, Tund," she said, her eyes reflecting the orange glow of the horizon. "We've found everything we need." He looked at her, the girl who had disappeared and the woman who had returned, and realized she was right. The mystery was solved, the codes were decoded, and the shadows were gone. They were no longer characters in a tragedy or ghosts in a machine. They were just two people, deeply in love, standing at the beginning of a story that they would write together, one day at a time. The ink of remembrance had finally dried, leaving behind a map that led, quite simply, to home. Justice took 2 decades, but the heart never stopped scanning for the truth. If this story moved you, share it for the ones who are still waiting to be found. Follow for more untold mysteries.